Winter is approaching and the diesel heater videos are popping up all over YouTube. But do you really need a diesel heater? Budget diesel heaters require a lot of finicky assembly and can be prone to malfunction, even dangerous malfunction. There are more reliable units out there, but they get expensive fast. And if you're only camping a handful of weekends per winter, that expense may be difficult to justify. And if you're not driving a diesel rig, getting a diesel heater means that you now need to carry 3 types of fuel: gasoline for your vehicle, propane for cooking, and diesel for your diesel heater. Now, I do quite a bit of cold camping, but I've continued to rely on my effective and budget-friendly Mr. Heater Buddy, which I've been using for years now. Now, this is a great little heater, but it's not perfect. In this video, I'm going to tell you about some of the pros and cons I've experienced using the Mr. Heater Buddy. Now, this video isn't sponsored in any way. I have no affiliation with the company. I purchased this some years ago. I've been using it ever since for cold weather camping. Just providing this information in case you're doing some research and want to learn a little bit more about this. So one of the big pros of the Mr. Heater Buddy is that it's very budget friendly. At full price, it's not terribly expensive compared to many of the other heating options you might look at for camping. If you keep an eye out to get them on sale, you can get really fabulous deals. I got a great price on this on sale some years ago. It has been completely worth the money. Another huge advantage to this heater is that it is simply so compact and portable. Very easy to throw in your rig, take it back out when you get back home. You don't have to build it in any place, although as you saw, I have a little spot to keep it secure in my camper. Diesel heater systems can end up being bulky because not only you have the heater unit, which sometimes is bigger than this, and you also have ducting, some way to sort of set it up outside of your rig if that's what you're doing, or else you have to, build it in to your rig someplace where it's going to consume, a chunk of storage space and simply be more complex in terms of installation and in terms of dealing with issues that may come up, which seems to be common. Other propane heat systems like the Propex, while certainly providing a better quality of heat, again, require a more complex installation with gas plumbing, ducting, wiring, electrical draw. This heater requires none of that. You buy it, throw it in your camper, throw it in your tent, use it, heat up. Another major advantage of this heater is that it is super, super fast and effective. Once you've got this fired up, it heats up instantly. It provides an incredible burst of heat that will heat up a small space like a camper or a tent in very, very little time. I almost always turn this immediately down to the low setting because it's more than enough heat for this little space that I've got here. Other heating systems don't put out such an intense hot heat, and so they have to run for, possibly 20-30 minutes before you really start seeing an effective accumulation of heat. This is great when I hop into the camper at night, turn it on to warm up the space, make it nice and comfortable for you getting into bed. I shut it off at night. In the morning, turn it back on, get it nice and toasty warm in here for getting dressed. Another pro of these heaters is simply that the fuel for them is easy to find and easy to work with. These little green bottles, you can buy them just about anywhere. If you're traveling, you run out of fuel. Also, transporting these little green bottles is easier and cleaner than trying to carry around an extra container of diesel. There's no worries about these spilling. They're compact. You can easily stick a few of these in various nooks and crannies in your rig and always make sure you've got some backup fuel. Now, obviously there are disadvantages to this, and I will talk about that also, but these do work well. They're easy to find. And the way I use this heater, just running it in the morning, running it in the evening, I can get a surprising number of days out of just one of these little green canisters.
It's impossible to give you an exact figure on how many days I can go on a single 1-pound canister. Depending on how cold it is outside and how much time I stay out by the campfire versus hanging out inside the camper before going to bed, there are just too many variables to be able to reliably predict how long a canister will last. The official specs indicate this will run for 3 hours on high or 6 hours on low. I only ever use the heater for some minutes at a time. I've never run it for a full hour at any setting, so it's difficult to gauge how those 3 or 6 hours are getting divided up over multiple days, and usually over multiple trips.
Now, earlier I mentioned the portability of this. That brings about an extra advantage of these, is that you could take it out of your rig, use it someplace else, use it in your garage, actually use it in your house in the event of a power failure where you don't have any way to create heat. You can use these indoors with just minimal ventilation. They're safe to use indoors. And I know people who have these in their basements for the sole purpose of backup heat in an emergency. Now let's talk about some of the cons of using one of these heaters, or at least things that I have found to be bothersome or annoying in some way. And we'll jump right to the big one right at the beginning, and that is the fact that this thing creates a lot of moisture in the air. All of the combustion occurs right here inside your camper, inside your tent, and a byproduct of burning propane is that water is released into the air. For me, most of the time this has actually not been a huge issue. Usually when I'm camping in cold weather, I'm someplace where it's dry over on the desert side of the state, and even if I get some moisture off the heater, it doesn't matter that much, the air is so dry, and even if I get a little, haze of condensation in the morning, it's usually gone by the time I'm ready to pack up the camper. On the flip side, when I'm camping on the wet side of the state, where the humidity is higher and it's harder for things to dry, it's usually warmer, and so while again I may get some condensation, I don't get a ton of condensation. Now, I recently returned from a trip out in the desert where it was unusually wet, and it was also very, very cold, about as cold as it could be without actually snowing. And on that trip, the condensation actually became an issue because it was so cold that more condensation wanted to accumulate, but it was so wet, the ground outside was saturated, it was raining constantly. I was constantly tracking more and more water into the camper, on my coat, on my shoes. It was just no chance for anything to dry. So I had condensation accumulating on the roof of my camper. For me, that was sort of an unusual circumstance. I've used this for years and never had that kind of an issue. When I used to use this in my Gazelle tent, that's a very well ventilated tent, it was never an issue of condensation, even in cold, wet weather. But there's no way around it. A big disadvantage of these is the moisture that they put out, and it's going to be especially noticeable if you're camping in very cold, very wet weather. Heating systems where the combustion occurs outside of the living space and it's just heating air that it blows into the space, those generally produce a much drier heat. You're not going to run into the issue of condensation that you're going to get with something like this. Another little detail some people may see as a disadvantage is the fact that there's no thermostat or anything like that for controlling the heat on this. It is basically on full blast, on low, or off. As I mentioned earlier, when this is running on full blast, it's very quickly too much heat, and even on the lower setting, unless it's really, really cold outside, even that warms up the inside of the camper too much. Over the years, I've gotten used to it. I'm in the habit of cycling the heat off to the high, to the low, or even just down to the pilot light in order to, regulate the temperature. When I start feeling chilled, I just bump it back up, let it bring some heat back into the space, bump it back down. It's not that big of a deal. You're not going to necessarily get as nice even heat as you would with a system that has a thermostat. Now, the way I use this just for a blast of heat when I go to bed at night, a blast of heat when I get up in the morning, it doesn't really matter. I'm not spending a large amount of time in the camper. I do not run it overnight. I shut it off when I go to bed. So I don't need, some sort of like even amount of heat regulated over a period of time. If that's the sort of heat scenario that you're looking for, maybe you've got a van, you want to spend a lot of time in your van during the day, this may not be the right solution. Now, I talked about these green canisters before as an advantage, but they're also a disadvantage. These things are not the most environmentally friendly. They're designed to be disposed of. You use it, once the propane is gone, it goes in the garbage. It's a lot of metal that gets produced to make these and then just goes into the landfill. You can get a hose for these and run it off of a larger propane bottle, which is a great idea. You do have to make sure you also get the filter for these, because a larger propane bottle and the hose can bring contaminants into the heater that will eventually gum it up and stop it from working properly. There are also kits for refilling these off of a propane bottle. I haven't done that myself. It's something that I actually probably want to investigate if I'm going to keep using this. So there are ways around the disadvantage of disposable propane canisters, but I would still call a disadvantage because the way most people are using this is they're buying these, they're using them, they're throwing them away. And one final fairly significant con for using this kind of heater is the fact that This is flame. You've got flame in here. This thing is a fire hazard. If you have a dog, their tail can brush up against this and ignite. If you're not careful and you accidentally have something slip up or drop against it, you can have that thing on fire in no time at all. And some of you in my friend Jason's recent video noticed the duct tape on the hood of my coat, and that was a mishap with the Mr. Heater Buddy, where I plopped my coat down, didn't realize how close it was to the heater, and it melted right through the hood of my otherwise very nice, not cheap REI down coat, which I love. I love this coat so much that I just taped it up with Gorilla Tape and have kept using it. It's been fine, but that underscores the danger of one of these heaters. You have to be very careful, you have to be very aware at all times. So if you're not familiar with these heaters, I'm going to show you how these work. First of all, you have to ignite the pilot light, and that requires sort of priming it a bit, which is also clicking a starter. Eventually the gas flame will stay there. You do have to hold down the knob in the pilot position for 20-30 seconds, depends on how cold the unit is to start with. That warms up a sort of a sensor, a thermocouple sensor, that will shut off the supply of propane if it doesn't feel like that there's heat there. So you basically have to warm that up, and then once it's warm, that pilot light stays on. Then you rotate the knob to the high position, and it's going to ignite the entire surface of the heater in there. This just takes a matter of seconds to get this to the point where it is fully glowing orange. Now that is the high setting. You can just run it like that. As I mentioned before, that produces a ton of heat. If you're in a small space, it's very quickly too much heat. Then you can turn the knob to low. It will burn less propane. It reduces the amount of heat. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes when I'm hanging out in the camper and I need, sort of more continuous heat, if I get to the point where I feel like it's plenty warm in the camper, I will just turn this back to the pilot light position. That will keep the pilot light will stay on using very, very little propane. This way, when I'm ready to cycle it back on, the pilot light's already on. I can just turn it back up to the high setting, let it fully ignite, and then turn it back to the low setting to maintain the heat inside the camper. When you're done, you just switch it all the way to the off position. It shuts everything down. Make sure that everything has cooled down fully before you pack this up into or put anything up against it. This metal on the outside gets very hot. Now, I've never had any issue with the surface that's down below here. I just have this sitting on the wood floor of my camper. In my tent, this would just be sitting on the floor of my tent. I've seen people, put these on cookie sheets or whatever, but I have not had any issue with any amount of heat accumulating, on the surface that it's sitting on. That heat comes out and is going up, and this right here does not heat up. In fact, I can touch this metal right here. It's not hot. The grill is hot, but this is not. Now, I mentioned the thermocouple that has to detect heat. That's probably the most finicky part of this heater. It can get dust or corrosion or contaminants, I don't know what. It can get compromised from use. And on my heater, it stopped working in the middle of a trip. I was out, and no matter how long I warmed up that pilot light, I could not get the propane to stay on. I had to do the rest of that trip without heat, and back home I took this to my local propane shop. They took it apart, replaced the thermocouple, and it has been working just fine ever since. I think it's something that can be avoided if you make sure to keep this covered, don't let dust get on it. So that thermocouple is one of the safety features. It shuts off the propane if it feels like the pilot light has gone out. There is also some kind of oxygen sensor that if the unit has consumed, a dangerous amount of the oxygen in the space that it's in, it will shut the heater off. I've not experienced that, so I can't report on how well that works, but they say that it has an oxygen sensor. It does also have a tip sensor. If it falls over one way or the other, it shuts itself off. You knock it over, you're not necessarily starting a fire. When you're using this inside, you should have a little bit of ventilation, a window cracked, some sort of way to get some fresh air in, because it is combustion. It is going to consume some of the oxygen in your space. So you don't want to use it in a perfectly enclosed space. It is safe to use inside, but you need a little bit of ventilation. I have never regretted making this purchase. This is completely transformed cold camping for me. It just takes it to another level when you can be comfortable and not chilled, especially at those transition moments when you're getting ready for bed, getting up in the morning. This is also just a really affordable way to get out and camp in the winter. See if you even like winter camping without investing, $100 hundreds or, you know, up to even $1,000 on some kind of heating system for your camping setup. And I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that this is a better heater than other options that are out there. It's not. There are definitely better options out there. But if you're not living in your camper and you're on a budget, this is a great way to get some heat and bring an extra level of comfort to your winter camping. If you have any questions, just post them in the comments below. And thank you for watching.